Hey everyone, so I know it's been a while since my last video. I've been really busy with speedrunning some raids recently, but I just wanted to make a little video investigating chill clip because I know a MossyMax tweet kind of blew up on Twitter recently that showcases a cool chill clip interaction where rocket chill clip kind of inherits the scalar of the rocket, and the freeze and the shatter eventually do a lot of damage. And so I wanted to do some testing and find out if there was any merit to this discovery in terms of boss DPS. And the findings that I have today are potentially a little bit interesting, but maybe not as insane or meta-defining or meta-shaping as I might have hoped for. So yeah, let's go ahead. I have a little outline here of what I'm going to talk about. Let's start with mechanics. Okay, so how does slowing and freezing actually work in Destiny? Okay, so the way slowing and freezing works, slow is a debuff, an elemental debuff that you can apply to an enemy using chill clip, using stasis turrets, using dusk fields, what have you, right? And every slow source has a duration and a stack amount. Okay, so for example, most chill clip weapons will apply 60 stacks of slow to a target. And once a target hits 100 stacks, then the target will freeze, and then it will automatically shatter after a given amount of time. It's like 3 seconds. And then, or you can do some damage to the target and it will shatter manually. So we're going to call the difference between these two shatters auto shatters, which is just letting the target shatter by itself, and then manually shattering, which is shooting the target to shatter it, well, manually. The way these kind of additive stacks work is, for example, chill clip on certain weapons like rocket sidearms is different, right? It only applies 40 stacks. So then that's how rocket sidearms work. You need to shoot 3 times in order to freeze a target. So 40, 40, 40, that's 120. That's over 100, and then you get the freeze. Okay, so that's number one, it's additive. Number two, slow stacks don't decay, right? Scorch stacks, if you've ever been scorched in PvP, you'll see the stacks kind of applied to you, and then they'll just rapidly decrease after some period of time. Slow stacks are not like that, okay? Scorch, the duration is based on how many stacks you have, and then it kind of like dissipates and goes away over time. Slow stacks, they have a set duration, but the actual stacks don't decay. So as long as you apply slow again and refresh the timer in some way, then the slow stacks will never decrease. So you'll be slowed x40, and then if you shoot again with chill clip, it'll be slowed x80, and the timer will reset. Okay, so that's the second mechanic. The third mechanic is that, like Scorch, so unlike Scorch, there's no decay, but like Scorch, slow and freeze inherits the initial scalar of whatever applied the slow. So this is interesting because bunch of different slow sources, whether we're talking Viability dusk fields or Bleak Watcher stasis turrets or chill clip, rocket sidearm, whatever you have, they all have different scalars, right? All of these weapons have different scalars, and rockets have a really high scalar because they're a boss damage weapon. They do really high damage per shot. It makes sense. They have a high scalar. So what I'm basically saying here is that you can use a rocket with chill clip, or I should say Mossy was the one who brought this forward, but you can use a rocket with chill clip to apply slow times 60 and then slow with any other source. And then the resultant freeze and the resultant shatter, they will inherit the scalars of the rocket. And these include modifiers such as buffs, debuffs, surges, right? Well, debuffs is obvious because debuffs will always apply because they're target based and not, damage source based. But buffs and surges, you would think that an elemental effect like a Shatter would not inherit these kind of buffs, but it does, right? And the same thing applies for scorches and ignitions, right? If you have a damage source that, for example, is like a Viability fusion grenade and you throw it at a boss, and it will take that scalar, and then whatever you throw at the boss after that to scorch it, complete the stacks required to get the ignition, that ignition will then inherit the initial scalar of that Viability fusion grenade that you threw at the start. Which is why when you do scorch and ignition based damage strategies, it's important that you don't allow someone who is using a low scalar scorch source to steal the ignition that will eventually be the source of the main damage that comes from these scorch damage strategies. So right off the rip, you can probably spot a problem here, right? If you have any other person in your fire team or any other really slow source that is going to be applying slow that isn't the rocket, then you need to be very careful and tasteful about when you actually choose to use this slow source. So that's like an important thing to keep in mind here. We're going to talk about some of these things when it comes to synergies and conclusions, but that is something that I want you guys to keep in mind. So very important that the rocket is the thing that applies the slow, and then after that you can really slow with anything, and the shatter will get the effect that you want. Let's talk about some base values. So an aggressive rocket to a boss in a raid does 94,163 damage with impact casing, and these two numbers are the kind of, explosion versus impact. A manual shatter from a chill clip rocket, so this would be, I'll show a clip of it on screen, but this would be shooting a chill clip rocket and then using like a shuriken or something, and then looking at those shatter numbers is going to be these two numbers combined, right? And that equals 19,643, which is an increase of 20.9%. which is decent. It's not too bad, but it's obviously not as good as something like honing, which is like 35 or 30%, or bait and switch, which is 30%, right? So manual shatter, not too terrible. And then obviously, if you have multiple people that are using chill clip rockets, then, most people are not going to be getting manual shatter numbers because you can only, shatter so often. So maybe only one person is going to get this benefit. Okay, so number 3, an auto shatter, on the other hand, from a rocket. So shooting a rocket and then maybe using a stasis shuriken or something to slow the boss afterward to get it to 100 slow stacks. Does 88,000. Now, this is not the rocket damage. This is just the shatter damage. Does 88,043 damage, which is a 93.5% increase to damage per rocket, which is even higher than the number that Mossy originally put forward in his tweet, which is not what I expected. I expected a lower number. This is actually higher. Right, I tested this multiple times, 93.5%, almost doubles the damage of the rocket. Mossy also mentioned that there is a certain time window, about half a second, where if you shoot the boss, or if you shoot the target that's frozen, right as it's about to auto shatter, you get the manual shatter number and you get the auto shatter number, right? Which adds up to 107,686, which more than doubles the damage of the rocket. In testing though, I will say that this is a little bit annoying of a timing to get off consistently, unless you have a sort of weapon rotation that always matches the exact timing window. I was able to kind of find something that sort of matches the time window, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But I would say just for the most part, rely on this manual shatter number because you're probably not going to be able to get both shatters super consistently. So now the question is, does the auto shatter scale, right? When you add well and when you add surges, does this 93.5% number stay 93.5%, or does this kind of just stay flat while the rocket number increases? And the answer is yes, it does scale, right? The 1156 number, which is, I don't know, some sort of maybe like impact or like maybe from Facet of Ruin or something, because I had Facet of Ruin on, does not scale. But the other number does. It scales perfectly, actually. This is the exact number that you would expect if you multiplied 86,887 by 3 surges, 22%, and well, 25%, right? So it scales perfectly. And that basically means that because this number is so small, you basically have scaling that's like 92.2% or something like that, right? Which is pretty crazy. Let's talk about some more comparisons when it comes to damage. So let's compare this to galley rockets, right? Because galley rockets, that's kind of like the gold standard for rocket damage. What is the comparison when it comes to damage per rocket? So Pack Hunter increases your rocket damage by about 25%. And then if we add honing times 5, which is a 35% buff on top of that, that results in a 68.3% buff per rocket. So still not as good as the 93 point, or I guess 92 technically once you add buffs. But yeah, 93-ish% boost to rockets per damage, per rocket damage, when we're comparing the two, right? Then again, obviously you do have to wait for the auto shatter for this one, so not really a valid comparison given that you can spam this one, but still pretty impressive damage per rocket. So let's talk about total damage, since that was an argument that was brought up by both Mossy and other people that were kind of talking about this. Like, total damage on rockets, especially without galley, is pretty known to be terrible. So what does this do to the total damage of a rocket, right? So if you go to the sustain tab here, I actually made a row for this and then deleted it because I was testing, but slide shot surrounded rockets, right? 11 aggressive rockets, crux termination, enhanced surrounded, 43-ish% damage perk with Wolfpack rounds. That is 3.6 million, right? And then if we look at something like Darcy, or we look at Acreus, we look at these numbers that I've, listed here, they're a lot higher, right? They're a lot higher. And obviously surrounded is very difficult to like maintain. If we go down to something like bait, it's even worse, right? You have like sub 3 mil total damage. So this is with Pack Hunter, by the way, right? So we're not even talking solo. And the argument here was that it was good for solo total damage. Now, if we look at this 11 chill clip rockets thing here that I have listed here, if you have something like a cold comfort with envious chill clip or whatever, and you don't have Pack Hunter, you still manage to hit almost 4 mil total from legendary weapons, right? And Leviathan's Breath hits like somewhere around 4 mil, Darcy hits somewhere around 4 mil, Queenbreaker hits 5.33, Whisper hits 6, Acreus hits 5.5. So this is no Pack Hunter, by the way. This is no Pack Hunter, and it's not an exotic weapon, right? So you'd be very hard pressed to find a legendary heavy that does this much total damage, especially when solo, right? So if you look at heavy GLs, for example, Envious Bait, Edge Transit, sub 3 mil. It's pretty impressive that, rockets can actually hit you know, just below 4 mil essentially. When you have exotics like Leviathan's Breath, which are exotic heavies, by the way, which, you know, are generally better when it comes to the total damage department. No galley, you know, pretty impressive stuff. So those are the numbers when it comes to comparisons. Now I want to talk about DPS, okay? So the big question that a lot of people had were like, okay, this is great and all, you know, it's great that the damage of every rocket goes up by a lot and total damage is great and all, but isn't it kind of stupid that you just shoot the rocket and then you kind of just sit there and wait for like the 2 to 3 seconds until the boss shatters? And the answer is yeah, it is. It is kind of dumb, right? It is not very good that you have to sit there and wait and do nothing. But, you know, the damage scientist in me thought, well, what are things you can do that in Destiny, you know, there's some weapons where you trade your time for doing more damage. Like the classic example would be box breathing, where you ADS for a while and then you're rewarded because your damage does more, your next shot does more damage compared to, like, you know, your average, you know, sniper shot, right? So what is a weapon that could fill this time where you're kind of just not doing anything and you're waiting for the boss to shatter? Well, there's a couple weapons. You have Tessellation, you have high impact fusion rifles. The faster charging fusion rifles like, you know, Bastion and Telesto and Lorenz and whatever, they do not, they charge too quickly for them to be used here, right? So the three that I honed in on were Izanagi's Burden, Tessellation with its kind of charging animation, as well as high impact frame fusion rifles with Withering Gaze. So again, this is kind of in the synergies area. And I tested Tessellation and it just took too long. It just took a little too long. I mean, you can use Tessellation. My idea here was to use Transcendence on Prismatic Hunter and eat the Prismatic Grenade and then use like Winter Shroud dodges to slow, or use shurikens to slow, and to also refuel that nade. And then every cycle of shooting your rocket, you would just shoot Tessellation. The problem is, I believe Tessellation's secondary effect on its catalyst, if you have stasis on, which obviously you have stasis on here, or I suppose you could maybe put on something that's not stasis, but you would want stasis to match the surges of your rocket. But the problem is that if you use Tessellation after the boss shatters or to shatter the boss, the secondary explosive from the catalyst will then slow the boss, and then that will take away from your rocket scalar capability, which would be kind of annoying, right? So you have to use it like without the catalyst or something like that. And then Withering Gaze high impact fusions. I tried high impact fusions. They still charge and fire too quickly to get the auto shatter. So you could wait like a little bit longer and sit there a bit awkwardly, but, you know, it's kind of up to you. And then obviously you don't need Withering Gaze every single cycle. So what are you going to do if you don't need Withering Gaze, right? It's kind of awkward. And then I tried Izzy. Okay, Izzy did end up kind of working out, and I'll show you guys a clip of what the rotation ended up looking like. It was kind of interesting, and I want to show you guys the results actually of that damage. Okay, so I did 3 tests. I did Izzy, Wilderflight, Hezen with Elemental Honing ×4 because Bait and Switch was pissing me off. So I used Elemental Honing ×4, which is a 30% buff, basically like Bait and Switch, but lasted the whole phase, was very consistent. So I basically just I cast my super. I didn't throw my super at the boss, right? I just threw it off the map. And then I just did Wilderflight, Izzy, Hezen, Hezen. Wilderflight, Izzy, Hezen, Hezen. Just over and over and over, right? And I took off Legend Incarnate. There were no artifact mods involved in the production of this rotation, okay? And then the second thing that I did was an Izzy Wilderflight bump rotation, right? And so the interesting thing about this rotation, what I did, is I used Prismatic Hunter with Winter Shroud and the slowing shurikens. And basically what I did was I used a Hoyle Coyote class item, but I'm pretty sure you don't need Hoyle Coyote. You can just use you know, just you know, no class item, honestly, and it would probably still work. But I did Rocket, Shuriken, and then I honed Izzy. I honed Izzy waiting for the shatter. And then instead of shooting the Izzy immediately, because Izzy has such a long lockout after you first hone it because of the changes that were made to Izzy like a couple years ago to stop people from using it as a solo DPS weapon just over and over, I would hone Izzy, and then I'd swap to Wilderflight. And I would ADS with Wilderflight, and by the time you swap to Wilderflight and ADS, the boss is right about to shatter, and you just shoot him with Wilderflight, okay? And then I would swap back to Izzy, which by now has eaten through most of its internal cooldown on firing lockout, and then I would shoot the Izzy, but I wouldn't hone it. I wouldn't hone the Izzy. I would stow the Izzy with 0 in the mag left over, okay? And the reason for that is because I want to use that time to kill time while I'm freezing the boss on my next rotation, right? So then I would switch back to the rocket, I would rocket, and then this time I would dodge with Winter Shroud and also to get a melee back. And then after I dodge, I would hone the Izzy, and then I would go back to the Wilderflight, same thing. So this rotation, super awkward to do. You have to hold R with Izzy if you're honing it from 0 and the gun tries to like manual reload and go back to like 4 in the mag. So it's super, super annoying to have to go back to Izzy and hone from 0. Would not recommend. You have to hold R super, super early compared to what you're used to. You have to hold R basically before you swap to the weapon. So really annoying, but I did get it to work. And it does consistently auto shatter with this timing. And yeah, that's the rotation that you see here in the red. And then finally, I also tried Queenbreaker because without particle, I just tried Queenbreaker with rewind and its catalyst and 3 surges, and just kind of shot Queenbreaker. And yeah, so this is the results, and this is the ammo used. So Queenbreaker, using 27 out of 28 shots because we wiped after the 27th shot, does around this much total damage, right? Somewhere around here, like 3.8, right? And in about 35 seconds, right? So fairly decent, right? And then you have Izzy Wilderflight Bump, which only used 8 out of the 11 rockets, used all the Izzy, and used a couple Wilderflight shots, right? And ended up around the same, right? The DPS is kind of similar, right? Although I would say the Izzy Wilderflight Bump rotation is mechanically much more annoying to execute. And seeing the clip now, you probably understand why. But yeah, in theory, you could kind of keep shooting this and probably hit maybe, I don't know, 4.5 mil, maybe 4.6 mil or something with just the rocket and waiting for shatters. But yeah, so basically the DPS is somewhere on Queenbreaker, except it doesn't require an exotic heavy, but it uses Izzy instead. I mean, you could use a different weapon. Okay, so what I'm getting at here is basically, this weapon does similar total damage to like a decent exotic heavy. DPS wise, if you want to match the DPS of an exotic heavy, you have to make some concessions and do some weird things. I don't know. It's kind of weird. I don't think, like, solo DPS wise, I really tried to make a rotation work. It's just kind of awkward. I don't know. And then obviously if you're going for a higher DPS rotation using just Izzy Wilderflight Hesen with no pausing or anything like that and just spamming shooting, obviously that's going to be higher DPS, but of course lower total damage. This thing hit 3.8. And the Izzy Wilderflight Bump, we only stopped because I wiped and I ran out of Izzy. But if I didn't run out of Izzy, I could keep going for a longer period of time. So yeah, you might be wondering, so what's the conclusion of all this? Basically, Chill Clip is interesting. It's interesting for sure. But I think it has more kind of value in roam content, or in like maybe solo GMs where you're looking to just stick a boss with a chill clip, maybe throw a shuriken at it and then just like run away for a little while, right? Because the total damage is very, very good for a legendary weapon, especially for a rocket. And the burst damage of just being able to like stick a boss once and then just like shuriken and then just run away instead of having to consistently like shoot on the boss with a more typical total damage weapon like a linear, definitely there's like a difference there, right? But in terms of DPS, I don't know. This is more of like an interesting academic find than anything. I don't think it's like super viable or anything like that. But let's briefly talk about synergies and conclusions, and then we'll wrap up. So synergies, I think the best slow sources for Chill Clip Rocket is going to be Winter Shroud, Withering Blade, a Chill Clip weapon of any kind, because Chill Clip on rockets applies 60 stack, so a 40 stack weapon like Tenacious is totally fine, or Riptide as well. And then I would say tick sources are not great. And we talked about this because a weapon, or not a weapon, but a tick source, a slow source like a stasis turret or a dusk field, after the shatter, if the rocket is not the first thing to apply the slow, you're not going to get that big chunk. So stasis turrets, you might be thinking, oh, Aegis said, you want like a consistent slow source that you can use with the rocket so that you can get the shatter. But, you might think that, but, it's kind of counterintuitive, because anything that kind of does sustain slow over time and isn't just like an on-hit application that happens once exactly when you want it, anything that's not controlled will kind of mess up your rocket scalar potential. And then time killers, we already talked about these three. I do think Izzy is the best, but you could get Tessellation to work. It's just you're never getting the double shatter if you use Tessellation. It's just way, 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 way too slow, right? You do like the sucking in animation of like charging up the grenade shot, and then by the time you start charging up your Tessellation, the boss is already shattered, right? So I don't know. You could do that, but you're never getting the double shatter. Not that the double shatter is like super important or anything, but yeah. So there's that. Okay, let's talk about conclusions. Roam content, I already said, champs, stick and move bosses, potentially useful. Solo DPS, lots of total damage for a legendary, especially for a rocket. But if we're comparing against linears like you saw against Scintillation, the damage difference is still like, it's fairly substantial, right? Linears are still going to be higher total damage and are kind of, usable for DPS as well in solo. So, requires a consistent slow source. Yeah, kind of restricts your build. Kind of requires you to play like Winter Shroud or run a Chill Clip weapon. I do think a Chill Clip weapon is like an underrated way of doing this, because you could just shoot like, the rocket and then shoot like a Liturgy, for example. That'd be a great pairing in terms of burst damage. And then boom, you would get the shatter of the rocket with the scalar, and then it'd be perfect. And then you could use whatever energy weapon. I was thinking of going like Liturgy, Stasis Tessellation because of Stasis Nade, and then Chill Clip Rocket. That'd be perfect, obviously, because then you have triple stasis. But yeah, it's still a very restrictive loadout. And then yeah, you need to wait to kill time during your auto shatter. So lots of caveats, not amazing. And then fire team DPS, just no, not happening, right? You can't do this in fire teams. Auto shatters are just never happening in a fire team. Nobody is pausing for 2 seconds to wait for a boss to shatter. Shatter damage is not shared between players. Like, you can't have multiple shatter instances happening at the same time, so that's an issue. And then obviously Wolfpack rounds, which are used with rockets commonly in DPS scenarios in fire team, are just not happening, right? Like, the Wolfpack rounds are going to repeatedly just slow and shatter and blah 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 on the target. Oh, actually no, they fixed that, didn't they? Yeah, so but anyways, the Wolfpack rounds are going to break the boss, right? They're going to manual shatter the boss, so not happening. One last thing, I did notice a fair amount of chunking. When I say chunking, I mean, I haven't talked about this recently because chunking is rather uncommon in the Destiny 2 sandbox these days. But chunking just refers to the health bar receiving more damage than the wipe screen. And I did notice that happened quite a bit with this chill clip stuff, to a greater extent than I'm usually used to. So, potentially interesting. But this bar that you see here, this red graph, accounts for that. It accounts for that. So even with chunking, it's still kind of just matching Queenbreaker, which is not super amazing or anything like that. And this is without particle, by the way, guys. This is just base Queenbreaker, how it is in the sandbox right now. No artifact mods were used here. Okay. And then finally, the last thing I want to talk about is if Bungie ever makes a rocket with chill clip and a damage perk, maybe we'll see some potential here because we know that the Shatter inherits the scalars of the rocket, so I would not be surprised at all if like a double damage perk rocket, or double damage quote unquote if you count chill clip as a damage perk, chill clip plus like honing or something, or chill clip plus surrounded, or chill clip plus bait, whatever it is, could see some potential here because you can use Winter Shroud to dodge and like freeze the target and also reload your rocket, so you don't need a reload perk. But yeah, could see some potential. But yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about today, guys. Bit of a rant session, but I hope you guys enjoyed me talking about chill clip, and I hope you guys learned something new. Definitely interesting, and it's cool to see another interaction like ignitions, where like the initial source is what determines the scalar that will eventually affect the big damage, the shatter / the ignition. So cool application of that, but unfortunately I don't think this is particularly useful in most content. I would see maybe solo players and like GMs or solo players doing like a cool challenge in like a dungeon or something like that, but the DPS is not high enough to compare against high DPS burst options, and the total damage is not high enough to compete against some of the legendary heavy options, because again, like I said before, you are compromising your either your loadout or your DPS, because this is with Izzy and Wilderflight and a crazy optimized rotation that was tailor-made specifically for this scenario that uses all of your kinetic special ammo, right? If you're using like a more typical rotation or like a more typical loadout that uses like a primary or something like that and not Izzy, then the damage is going to be even lower, right? Because a fair amount of this chunk damage is from Izzy, right? So the damage is going to be even lower then. And yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Yeah, enjoy, guys, and I might do the dungeon breakdown series pretty soon, or we'll maybe work on like another special project. And those of you that have been tuning into the streams to support us during runs, thank you so much, and I'll continue to see you guys around. Goodbye for now.